Imagine walking into a church this Sunday morning.
Okay.
The music fades out, the congregation settles down, and the guy at the front steps up to the microphone.
Right.
He clears his throat, he adjusts his notes, and he introduces himself by saying, good morning, my official title is the Naval Deployment.
That would be pretty strange.
Right. Or maybe he looks out at the crowd and says, hello, everyone, I am the FedEx tracking number.
Yeah, people would definitely be looking around for the exits.
You would think he was having a break from reality. You'd look around to see if you were in the right building. Because, I mean, we expect titles to carry a sense of reverence, or at least describe a human function, like teacher or director or shepherd.
Yeah, that makes sense.
If you are listening to this, you probably think of a leader as a visionary, a skilled orator, or maybe a spiritual CEO. But we are about to see why the early church would have viewed a visionary CEO as a totally disqualified fraud.
It is a massive shift in how we think about authority.
Welcome to a brand new deep dive on Reformed thinking. Today, we are opening up a massive stack of lexical, historical, and theological notes surrounding a single heavily loaded concept. We are looking at the word apostle.
Yeah.
In the original Greek language, you have apostolē for the noun of the office and apostellōs for the person holding it.
Right.
Our mission for this deep dive is to uncover how a word that originally described ancient cargo ships moving grain across the Mediterranean evolved into one of the most weighty titles in all of religious history.
And the progression of this word is startling. Because the men who penned the New Testament documents, they didn't just invent the word apostle out of thin air.
They didn't make it up.
No, they found it out in the secular world, and they completely hijacked it for their own purposes.
Wow.
They took a word with a very specific, almost mundane logistical background, infused it with rigid Jewish legal codes from the rabbinic courts, and utilized it to describe a radical new framework of authority.
So they completely repurposed it.
Yes, and the result is a concept of representation that stands in total opposition to how the Greco-Roman world viewed authority, and frankly, it stands in opposition to how we view it today.
So by tracing this word through Greek shipyards, Jewish courts of law, and the letters of the Apostle Paul, we are going to find a picture of authority that demands complete submission. We have to start with these secular Greek roots.
Good place to start.
Take us back to the classical Greek usage before the 1st century. If I'm walking around Athens in the 5th century BC, where am I going to hear this word and what are people talking about?
Well, to find the earliest classical Greek usage of apostolos, you have to go down to the docks.
The shipping docks.
Yeah, you need to look at the shipyards, the merchants, and the military strategists. The word was originally an adjective related to seafaring.
Okay.
In the older classical period, during the time of the Peloponnesian War, for example, it meant a naval expedition. It described a dispatched fleet of triremes heading out to battle.
So it was a military term.
Often, yes. Occasionally, it was used to describe a band of colonists sent out across the sea to establish a new settlement. But the word is tied directly to the verb apostellō, which means to send forth.
I see.
So you would have an apostolos fleet, quite literally a dispatched fleet, and as the centuries rolled on, the noun form came to be applied to the ships themselves. It became a technical term for a freighter or a transport ship moving goods across the water.
So it is a purely mechanical, logistical term.
Yes, very mechanical.
It has absolutely nothing to do with religion, nothing to do with speaking on behalf of the gods, and nothing to do with personal authority. It is just the act of sending cargo, grain, or troops across the Mediterranean.
That is spot on. In those early secular usages, there is a distinct lack of initiative on the part of the apostolos.
What do you mean by lack of initiative?
Well, the naval fleet doesn't decide where it is going, right? The admiral or the state decides. The cargo ship does not choose its destination. The merchant decides.
Oh, I see.
The word simply denoted the objective state of being sent. The entity being sent is a passive instrument in the hands of the sender. And if we look at later Greek papyri, particularly the business documents recovered from the sands of Egypt, the usage becomes even more administrative and rigid.
What kind of administrative documents are we talking about? Like, how did average merchants use the word in everyday commerce?
So we have recovered thousands of papyri from places like Oxyrhynchus in Egypt, detailing everyday life in the ancient world. And in these commercial documents, apostolos is used as the technical term for an accompanying bill of lading.
Like an invoice.
Yes, an invoice for shipments of grain. When a massive freighter loaded with Egyptian corn was preparing to sail to Rome to feed the empire, there was extensive paperwork.
Right.
The apostellos was the literal document that traveled with the cargo, detailing what was on the ship and who sent it.
Oh, okay.
In other administrative documents, it is used to describe a passport or a dispatch note. It is a piece of paper that gets stamped by an official.
That is fascinating.
Oh. Yeah, the concept is completely abstracted from anything personal or relational. It is the furthest thing imaginable from an authoritative, speaking, human messenger.
That makes the New Testament usage seem completely bizarre. Because, I mean, the Greek language is famous for being incredibly precise, right?
Highly precise.
They had a massive vocabulary. If they wanted to describe someone bringing news or speaking for a deity, there were established terms for that, surely.
Oh, definitely. Greek is exceptionally wealthy in vocabulary for communication. If the Greeks wanted to talk about a messenger, they used words like angelos.
Which is where we get the English word angel.
Yes, meaning one who announces news. They had the word kerix, which means a herald.
Like the town crier.
Yeah, the person who walks into the town square and shouts the decree of the king. They also had words like presbytes, meaning an ambassador or an envoy sent to negotiate a treaty.
Okay, so they had plenty of options.
They use those traditional words constantly, especially when talking about their own religious systems. The Greek prophets, the women who spoke for the Oracle of Delphi while sitting over the volcanic fissures.
Right, the famous oracle.
They were seen as mouthpieces for the god Apollo. The culture used those traditional messenger words to describe them. For a Greek speaker in the first century, hearing a human being claim the title of apostolos was a strange, jarring, linguistic innovation.
Like my FedEx cracking number analogy.
Yes, it was so unusual that when the Latin speakers of the early church encountered it in the Greek New Testament, they didn't even try to translate it into a Latin equivalent.
Really?
Yeah, they just brought it over as a loan word, apostolos, because there was no equivalent in their religious or political vocabulary.
Okay, but was there any Greek precedent at all for a person being called an apostolos before Christianity came along? Did any Greek philosophers or religious figures try to make this shipping term personal?
There is one notable exception in the classical sources, and it comes from the world of Hellenistic philosophy.
Okay, who was it?
Specifically, we see it in the teachings of the Cynic Stoic philosopher Epictetus. The Cynics were a fascinating group. They were wandering philosophers who lived in voluntary poverty, wearing ragged cloaks, and they had a very high view of their own intellectual calling.
Right, the guys yelling in the streets.
Yeah, Epictetus taught that the true Cynic philosopher was sent directly by Zeus. He used the verb apostellō to describe this authorization from the divine.
Oh, interesting.
But to describe the philosopher himself, his core identity, he used the word kataskopos, which means a spy or a scout of the gods.
Spy of the gods. That sounds incredibly dramatic, almost like a divine secret agent.
It was intended to carry that dramatic weight. The Cynic claimed a mandate from the universe to observe humanity, to investigate how everyday people were living, and to sharply correct them.
So they were judging everyone.
Constantly. He saw himself as an angelos, and a kerix of the gods. But this role of kataskopos was unique. The Cynic would walk into the crowded marketplace, look at the merchants, the politicians, and the laborers, and essentially tell them they were all living foolish, enslaved lives.
Wow.
He claimed absolute freedom from all human conventions, social norms, and human laws, answering only to the supreme reason of Zeus. Epictetus even referred to the true Cynic philosopher as a king and lord of the earth.
So these cynics were acting like modern-day internet gurus or, those sovereign citizens you see in viral videos who claim they answered to no earthly laws, only to the universe.
That is a brilliant comparison.
They walk around with total self-assurance, barking at everyone else about how to live because they believe they have this direct, unmediated pipeline to divine reason.
Mm-hmm.
But that Greek philosophical view of a messenger fails to match the biblical view of an apostle, right? It seems way too arrogant, way too self-centered.
It is.
Why does that Cynic model fall short of what we see in the New Testament?
The Cynic model falls short because the Cynic saw himself as a partner with the deity.
A partner.
Yes, the philosopher was almost an equal to Zeus in terms of rational capacity. They frequently use the term divine man to describe themselves. The focus of the Cynic was heavily fixed on his own self-consciousness, his own moral superiority, and his own initiative.
Very ego-driven.
Entirely ego-driven. He judged the masses based on his own rational assessment of their behavior. He was basically an independent contractor who happened to be aligned with the mind of Zeus.
Okay, I see the difference.
There was no concept of strict binding legal representation. The Greek gods of the pantheon were far too mythical, too detached, and too chaotic for there to be any kind of concrete legal covenant with a human being.
So where do we find the actual roots then?
To find the true DNA of the biblical apostle, we have to leave the Greek shipyards and the wandering Greek philosophers entirely. We have to look east to the rigid structures of Jewish legal codes.
That brings us to a major shift in the sources. We move from the Greek word apostolos to the Hebrew root word shaliach.
Yes, exactly. The Hebrew verb shaliach translates quite simply as to send. But out of this basic verb grew a highly developed rabbinic institution, the institution of the shaliach, which translates as the emissary or the commissioned representative.
The shaliach.
Right. This specific legal role is the true cultural and theological backdrop for the New Testament apostle.
Let us examine this Jewish context. What made the shaliach so different from a Greek herald running into a town square with news or a Roman ambassador negotiating a border dispute?
The defining rule of this institution is summed up in a very famous basic rabbinic phrase found in the Talmud. The one sent by a man is as the man himself.
Wait, the one sent by a man is as the man himself. That is a massive claim. It implies a total transfer of identity.
And it was a strict legal reality within Jewish society. It was not a spiritual metaphor, and it was not a poetic figure of speech used for dramatic effect.
So it held up in court.
Completely. When a Jewish court, the Sanhedrin, or an individual citizen commissioned a shaliach, that emissary carried the full, unquestionable legal weight of the person who sent them.
That is wild.
The mechanics of this are fascinating. A shaliach could legally betroth a wife for you.
Wait, really?
Yes. The proxy could travel to another village, meet with the family, go through the entire betrothal ceremony, exchange the bridal price, and the marriage was as legally binding as if you had stood there yourself.
Wow, so you wouldn't even have to be there.
Nope. And a shaliach could also divorce your wife for you.
Oh, wow.
The authorities given to the representative were so extensive and locked in that if the shaliach executed the divorce decree and handed over the certificate, the husband could not suddenly change his mind the next day and reverse the decision.
Because it was already legally done.
Exactly. The transaction was final because the proxy's action was legally the sender's action. The shaliach could conduct commercial business in your name, buy and sell property, or even slaughter the Passover lamb on your behalf at the temple.
I want to make sure I understand the mechanics of this. How did the Jewish courts verify this? Because if I show up in a village claiming to be your shaliach and I try to buy a piece of land in your name, the seller has to know I am legitimate.
Right.
There must have been some kind of rigorous authorization process, right?
There was a highly formalized process. The commissioning of a shaliach was not just a casual conversation. It required witnesses, and often it required a written document, a legal authorization that specified the specific parameters of the commission.
So they couldn't just do whatever they wanted.
No, not at all. The proxy was given a highly defined task. If they stepped outside the boundaries of that specific task, their legal backing vanished. But as long as they remained within the confines of the commission, their actions were legally unimpeachable.
So interacting with the shaliach was legally identical to interacting with the sender. It completely flips our modern view of representation on its head.
It really does.
Because today, an ambassador negotiates. We send diplomats to hash out treaties, to compromise, to find middle ground with foreign nations. But a shaliach did not have the autonomy to negotiate.
None whatsoever.
They were an exact legal copy of the sender's will. Absolute obedience to the commission was the only requirement. Like, if you are sent to buy a field for a specific price, you buy it for that price. You do not haggle to prove how smart you are, and you do not walk away if you think the land is ugly. Your personal opinion is completely irrelevant.
Your personal opinion does not exist in this transaction. The focus is entirely on the form of the authorization, not the personal brilliance, wisdom, or rhetorical skill of the messenger.
Because you're just the proxy.
Yes. Because the shaliach carried the exact identity of the sender, how you treated the proxy was legally viewed as how you treated the sender.
So if I'm nice to the proxy, I'm nice to you.
And this meant that honoring the proxy was honoring the master, but attacking the proxy was a direct assault on the master.
That makes sense.
There is a brutal graphic illustration of this concept in the Old Testament, specifically in Teacher Samuel chapter 10.
Oh, I know this story.
Yeah, the geopolitical situation is tense. King David of Israel sends emissaries to offer condolences to Hanun, the newly crowned king of the Ammonites, after Hanun's father passes away.
Just a standard diplomatic mission.
Right. But Hanun's commanders are suspicious. They convince the young king that David's men are not there to mourn. They argue that these men are actually spies sent to scout the city for an invasion.
Oh.
So Hanun takes action against David's messengers. He takes these emissaries, shaves off half of their beards, cuts off their garments in the middle right at the buttocks, and sends them back across the border in utter disgrace.
The shame in the ancient Near East must have been overwhelming. I mean, a man's beard was a symbol of his dignity and his status.
It was everything.
To shave half of it off and to expose them physically like that is a horrific humiliation.
It is a massive violation of hospitality and human dignity. But the crucial element of the story is David's reaction.
How does he react?
When David receives word of what happened, he does not view this just as a tragic assault on those specific men. He does not send a letter of complaint.
Right, he doesn't just ask for an apology.
No, he views the physical mutilation of his emissaries as a direct, undeniable declaration of war against the throne of Israel. The shaming of the messengers is legally and practically the shaming of the king himself.
That is intense.
The result is a massive military mobilization. David sends Joab and the entire army of the mighty men, leading to a war of total destruction against the Ammonites and their Syrian allies.
All because of how the messengers were treated.
Yes. The principle driving that slaughter is clear. The emissary of a king is as the king himself. An attack on the proxy requires the exact same response as an attack on the crown.
That brings up a fascinating contradiction from the notes that I need to throw at you.
Okay, let's hear it.
We are talking about the Jewish legal proxy representing the sender. If a shaliach represents God, and if the Old Testament prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah were constantly speaking on behalf of God, walking into the royal courts and declaring, "Thus says the Lord," why weren't the Old Testament prophets called shaliach?
That is a great question.
Weren't they God's absolute authorized messengers?
The rabbinic handling of that specific issue is brilliant, and it clarifies the boundaries of the concept. The rabbis in the Talmudic literature specifically avoided calling the ancient prophets shaliach.
Aye.
The reason comes down to the strict definition of what a legal proxy actually does. A prophet simply speaks.
Okay.
A prophet is a herald. They're given a divine word, a warning, or a promise, and they deliver it to the audience. But a shaliach takes concrete legal action.
Oh, I see the difference.
Right. A shaliach performs an active function that changes a legal reality on the ground, such as finalizing a marriage, executing a divorce document, or offering a physical sacrifice at the altar.
And the prophets didn't do that.
The prophets were not authorized to execute legal transactions on God's behalf in that manner. They were authorized to speak his words. This distinction, between a herald who just speaks and a proxy who takes authoritative action, perfectly sets up how the New Testament authors, particularly the Apostle John, utilized the Greek verbs of sending.
That gap between speaking and acting is a great bridge into the language of the New Testament. We have this intense Jewish legal framework of the proxy, and we have these Greek words for sending waiting to be utilized by the writers.
Exactly.
Let us examine the actual verbs. The Greek language has two main verbs for sending, pempo and apostellō. In a lot of beginner Greek classes, they are taught as basic synonyms. But is there a functional theological difference in how they are deployed?
In older classical Greek, those two verbs could sometimes bleed together in everyday usage. But in the text of the New Testament, particularly in the Gospel of John, they are utilized with breathtaking precision.
Really? How so?
Well, pempo is the standard verb for sending. It describes the simple, objective fact of sending someone or something. It is moving an object or a person from point A to point B. It carries no inherent legal weight.
Okay, so pempo is basic sending.
Yes. But apostellō, which shares the root with the noun apostolos, carries a much heavier burden. It means sending someone with a specific commission, a defined task, and legal authorization. It is sending someone as an official representative.
So if pempo is just moving something from point A to point B, that is like dropping a letter in the mail. I write a letter, I put a stamp on it, and the postal service moves the physical object to your house.
Right, very mechanical.
But apostellō is, is it like sending somebody to court for you? Like giving your lawyer a legal authorization document?
That is a highly accurate way to visualize it.
Sure.
But let's push that lawyer analogy even further to see the mechanics of it.
Okay.
If you send your lawyer into a courtroom to represent you, they cannot just walk up to the judge and start making demands based on their own charisma.
Right. They'd get thrown out.
They have to carry a signed document proving that they are authorized to act on your behalf. In the ancient world, apostellō involves that transfer of legal standing. One verb is just moving a piece of paper across town, while the other verb is moving your actual binding authority into a courtroom.
Wow, that is a huge difference.
And when you read the Gospel of John with that distinction in mind, a structural pattern emerges that is staggering.
What does John do with it?
In John, Jesus constantly talks to the Pharisees and the crowds about being sent by God. But he switches back and forth between these two verbs, pempo and apostellō, depending on the specific theological reality he wants to highlight in that exact moment.
Oh, that is so subtle.
When Jesus wants to ground his authority in God, when he wants to prove to the hostile religious leaders that he is not just a rogue, self-appointed rabbi acting on his own pretension, he uses apostellō. He is declaring, I am commissioned. I have the divine legal backing.
He is validating his legal standing to be doing the things he is doing, like healing on the Sabbath or overturning the tables in the temple. He is citing his legal precedent.
That is precisely what he is doing. But when Jesus wants to point out God's active, ongoing participation in his earthly mission, he shifts his vocabulary and uses pempo.
Really? Why pempo?
Well, in John's Gospel, Jesus frequently refers to God with a specific recurring title, the Father who sent me, using a participle form of the verb pempo. He uses this word to show that the Father is not a distant, detached deity sitting back in heaven watching Jesus do all the heavy lifting on earth.
Oh, I see.
The Father is the sender, the active, continuous participant in the mission. It is fascinating that Jesus never calls God the one who apostellō me as a formal title.
That is wild.
He uses apostellō as a statement of historical fact regarding his own credentials and authorization, but he uses pempo to describe the Father's continuous, intimate, active involvement in his daily life.
If Jesus is holding this divine legal authorization, what does this mean for his view of his own authority on earth? Does this imply that Jesus saw himself as possessing a blank check from the Father? Yeah. Like God signed the bottom of the check, handed it to the Son, and said, go down to earth and spend this authority however you see fit based on the situation?
It is the total opposite of a blank check.
Really?
The concept of a blank check implies independence and autonomy. The shaliach possesses zero independence. The Gospel of John makes this theological reality incredibly clear, and it aligns perfectly with the Reformed understanding of Christ's active obedience and submission to the Father's decree.
Right.
Jesus states plainly, I can do nothing on my own. He tells the crowds, the words that I say to you, I do not speak on my own authority, but the Father who dwells in me does his works.
Total submission.
The absolute unbroken unity of will between the Father and the Son leaves no room whatsoever for Jesus to operate as an independent contractor, like that Greek Cynic philosopher we discussed earlier.
He's not just out there acting on his own.
No, Jesus is the ultimate flawless proxy. His authority over disease, nature, and the Sabbath is absolute, precisely because his submission to the Father's will is absolute. There is no daylight between the commission of the sender and the action of the sent one. And this specific framework, this intense, unbreakable tension between total authority and total submission, is what Jesus then hands down to his own followers.
Let us examine that transition in the timeline. We are looking at Jesus during his earthly ministry, interacting with his disciples, these fishermen and tax collectors in Galilee.
Right.
Jesus takes this title, this heavy legal concept of the shaliach, and applies it to his inner circle. He calls them apostles. And he doesn't just gather them around a fire and give them a motivational speech. The text says he gives them exousia.
A Greek word meaning authority or right.
He gives them authority over demons and disease, and he sends them out into the surrounding villages to preach.
And this is where the abstract legal reality of the shaliach becomes visible in the dust and dirt of first-century Galilee. When Jesus sends out the 12 on this initial mission, he is not just asking them to share some good advice or teach some moral maxims.
He's delegating to them.
He is delegating his own exousia to them. They are authorized to use his name. In the ancient Jewish context, to act in the name of someone was to formally invoke their legal authority and their backing. It was presenting the legal authorization document.
There is a story in the sources that illustrates this perfectly, and I want to get your read on it. It is the moment when John, one of the inner circle, comes to Jesus and complains.
Yeah.
John is highly agitated because he saw an outsider, someone not in their specific group, casting out demons in your name.
Yeah.
Says they tried to stop the man because he wasn't part of their authorized band. For years, I read that story and assumed John was just being petty or jealous that someone else was getting attention, or maybe he was just being tribal. But based on this rigid legal framework of the proxy, John actually has a completely valid legal complaint, doesn't he?
He has an exceptionally valid complaint based on the legal structures of his day.
Wow.
John is incensed because this outsider is not an authorized shaliach. The outsider is using the name of Jesus. He is drawing down the legal authority and the spiritual backing of Jesus without having received the formal commission.
That's illegal.
To go back to your earlier analogy, it is like someone walking into a bank, presenting a forged authorization document, and trying to withdraw funds from an account that does not belong to them.
That makes so much sense now.
John knows that the exousia to cast out demons was delegated specifically to the 12 by Jesus. The outsider is arrogating a legal right that he has not been granted.
But Jesus corrects him.
Right.
Now, Jesus, of course, tells John not to stop the man, demonstrating a sovereign grace that transcends the strict legal boundaries the disciples are trying to enforce. Jesus says, "For the one who is not against us is for us." But John's initial panic reaction proves that the disciples understood their authorization as a specific, exclusive legal proxy. They knew how much weight the name carried.
And when the disciples return from these preaching tours in the villages, they are ecstatic. They report back to Jesus, rejoicing, saying, "Lord, even the demons submit to us in your name."
Yes, they were thrilled.
Notice what is missing from their report. They completely ignore their own abilities. They do not come back saying, "Wow, my public speaking skills have really improved," or "I have really developed my exorcism technique. I have the phrasing down perfectly."
They don't take any credit.
They recognize that the demon submitted to the name to the authority of the sender. Think about the immense psychological freedom this must have given those early disciples. These were uneducated men, common laborers, facing terrifying spiritual realities. But they had absolutely no pressure to perform out of their own charisma or their own intellect or their own inherent righteousness.
Because it wasn't about them.
Their success or failure out in those villages was entirely the responsibility of the one who sent them. When they spoke the message they were given, when they invoked the name as instructed, they had fulfilled their duty. They were simply the bearers of the authority, not the source of it. The rabbinic principle held perfectly true in their minds. The one sent by a man is as the man himself.
So when they spoke, the demons heard Jesus.
Yes. When they spoke, the demons heard the voice of Jesus.
But there is a very dark side to that legal rule, isn't there?
There is.
Because Jesus warns the disciples repeatedly that they will be rejected, they will be dragged before councils, they will be beaten, and they will be hated. If a shaliach is treated exactly like the master and the world hates the master, then being an apostle is basically a legal guarantee that you're going to suffer.
It is a promise of pain.
The proxy absorbs the hostility meant for the sender.
That is the inevitable, unavoidable consequence of this type of proxy in a fallen world. Jesus tells them explicitly, "A servant is not greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him."
The logic is brutal.
He lays out the logic. If they called the master of the house Beelzebul, if they accused the sender of being empowered by the prince of demons, how much more will they malign those of his household? The disciples are legally and practically bound to the fate of the sender.
Wherever the sender goes, they go.
If the sender is welcomed with a feast, the proxy sits at the table. But if the sender is marching toward a crucifixion, the proxy will inevitably face the cross as well. However, we must remember that this limited mission before Easter, these short preaching tours in the region of Galilee, were just practice. They were temporary deployments.
Right.
The definitive institution of the apostolate, the moment it became a world-altering reality, happened after the resurrection. That event fundamentally changed the scope and duration of the word.
Let us examine that transition because this raises a massive legal question. We have established that the proxy derives all authority from the living sender.
Correct.
So Jesus is crucified on Friday, he is dead and buried. Technically, under the law of agency, when the sender dies, the proxy's commission is immediately and legally terminated. Their authority vanishes the moment the sender takes his last breath.
Legally speaking, yes.
So how did the disciples justify keeping this authority? How do they maintain the apostolate after Good Friday?
That is the crucial question. And it is why the resurrection is not just a theological victory. It is a legal necessity for the existence of the church. If Jesus remained in the tomb, The disciples would have had no authority whatsoever to continue preaching or acting in his name.
Because the sender is gone.
Their commission would have expired. The resurrection is the pivot point for the entire concept of the New Testament apostle. Before Easter, their mission was confined to the geographical borders of Israel, and it was strictly temporary. They went out, they came back, their commission was fulfilled.
But after Easter?
After Easter, the resurrected living Lord appoints his representatives for a permanent mission. He authorizes them for the entire period between his resurrection and his final return, and he expands the jurisdiction from Israel to the ends of the earth.
So it's a global commission now.
It becomes a permanent, lifelong deployment. And the non-negotiable requirement to be in this initial, unrepeatable group of apostles was having physically seen the resurrected Christ. They were not just teaching a new ethical philosophy. They were legally commissioned eyewitnesses to a historical event that shattered the laws of nature.
Which brings us to the controversial topic of the signs. The sources talk at length about these signs of an apostle, the semia. These are the miracles, the healings, the dead being raised, the supernatural events recorded throughout the book of Acts.
Yes.
Modern, secular readers often view the miracles in Acts as legends. They assume these are exaggerated stories added centuries later by a developing church trying to make Peter and Paul look heroic and larger than life.
Right, that's a common view.
But based on this rigid legal definition of the shaliach, if you remove the miracles from the narrative, doesn't the entire claim of the apostolate collapse?
It collapses completely. In the Semitic legal mind, if you are going to stand in the temple courts and claim to be the authorized, binding representative of the creator of the universe, you need undeniable objective credentials.
You can't just talk.
The miracles were not magic tricks meant to build a cult of personality around Peter or Paul. They were not designed to make the apostles wealthy or famous. They were the legally required proof of the sender's backing.
So it's an Old Testament parallel.
Think back to the Old Testament narrative. When God calls Moses at the burning bush and sends him to confront Pharaoh, Moses doesn't just show up at the palace in Egypt and give a compelling philosophical speech about human rights.
No, he brings signs.
God gives him signs. His wooden staff turns into a living serpent. His healthy hand becomes leprous and then is healed, to prove to the skeptical Israelites and to the hostile Egyptian court that the God of the Hebrews actually sent him. The signs authenticate the commission.
So the miracles in the book of Acts are functioning as a divine ID badge. They are the watermark on the authorization document, proving it is not a forgery.
That is exactly how they functioned. If the messenger of a man is as the man himself, and if the apostles claim to represent the resurrected Jesus who possesses all authority in heaven and on earth, the absence of supernatural backing would signify that their claim was entirely invalid.
It would just be empty words.
It would prove that their preaching was just human theorizing, not a message backed by divine sovereignty. The miracles, the lame walking, the blind seeing, prove that the resurrected Jesus is actively, currently working through them.
Without the signs, they're just like the cynics.
Yes. Without the signs, they are no different from the cynic philosophers barking in the marketplace. With the signs, they are the authorized legal representatives of a living, reigning king. And perhaps no one in the early church understood this immense burden, this crushing weight of representation, better than the Apostle Paul.
Let us examine the case of Paul, because his inclusion in this group stretches the classical definition of the apostolate to its absolute limit.
It really does.
Paul was not one of the original 12. He was not a Galilean fisherman following Jesus around the lake. He had zero contact with the earthly Jesus.
None.
In fact, he was a Pharisee who was actively hunting down, arresting, and authorizing the execution of the early Christians. He was the enemy. Yet, he bursts onto the scene in the epistles and claims absolute, unquestionable equal footing with Peter, James, and John. How does he legally and theologically justify that claim?
Paul justifies his apostleship through a sudden, violent, objective break in his life.
To Damascus Road.
Yes, his encounter with the risen Christ on the road to Damascus. For Paul, his calling was not a gradual realization of truth, and it was not a decision he made after weighing the evidence. It was a hostile takeover of his life by a sovereign God.
He didn't sign up for it.
He was literally riding to Damascus with legal arrest warrants from the high priest to drag Christians into prison. He was breathing threats and murder. And in that state of total rebellion, he was struck blind by a light from heaven and confronted directly by the voice of the resurrected Jesus.
That changes everything.
That specific, undeniable historical moment defined his entire apostolic consciousness for the rest of his life. He saw himself as drafted by the unilateral will of God, much like the ancient prophets.
The sources draw a very heavy comparison between Paul and the Old Testament prophet Jeremiah. Let us dig into that parallel, because it reveals so much about how Paul viewed his daily job and his suffering.
The structural parallels between Paul and Jeremiah are striking, and Paul intentionally leans into them in his writing.
Where do we see that?
First, you look at the timing of Jeremiah's calling. God tells Jeremiah that he was appointed a prophet to the nations before he was even formed in the womb. It was a sovereign decree prior to his existence.
Wow.
Paul uses almost identical language about himself in the letter to the Galatians, stating that God had set him apart from his mother's womb and called him by his grace.
As a direct link.
Second, both men faced intense, relentless physical and emotional suffering because they were entirely subordinated to a word they could not change.
Right.
Jeremiah's life was an absolute misery of rejection. He was thrown into a muddy cistern, beaten and mocked because he refused to alter the unpopular message God gave him regarding the destruction of Jerusalem.
And Paul's life is the same.
Paul's life reads the exact same way. Multiple shipwrecks, lashings, stonings, starvation, and imprisonment. But the most crucial parallel between the two men is their complete rejection of ecstatic frenzy as a proof of divine authority.
What do you mean by ecstatic frenzy in this context? How did the ancient world view religious inspiration?
In the ancient Mediterranean world, especially in the Greek and Hellenistic environment, religious authority was almost always tied to losing your mind in a state of ecstasy.
And going crazy.
The prophets of the Greek oracles, like the Pythia at Delphi, would inhale toxic fumes, foam at the mouth, go into trances, and babble incoherently. The priests would then interpret this babble for the worshippers. Even among some of the later Jewish mystics and various Hellenistic mystery cults, the absolute proof that you were touched by the divine was this ecstatic, out-of-body rapture where you completely lost your rational faculties. You were overwhelmed by the God.
But Jeremiah didn't do that.
Jeremiah broke from the older, more ecstatic models of prophecy in the ancient Near East. He was sober, he was rational, he was awake, and he was driven purely by the objective word of God, not by an emotional trance.
And Paul operates the exact same way. It is almost as if Paul is intentionally hiding his spiritual resume from his churches.
He really is.
The text shows that Paul actually had extraordinary visionary experiences. He writes in 2 Corinthians about being caught up to the third heaven, experiencing paradise, and hearing things that cannot be uttered by human lips. But he severely downplays them. He refuses to use his supernatural visions to win theological arguments or secure loyalty from his followers. Why would he hide that? Because in that culture, bragging about a vision of the third heaven would guarantee you a massive following. But he knows that doing so would make people follow Paul, the spiritual giant, instead of Jesus, the sender.
That realization is the very core of Paul's apostolic defense, particularly in his correspondence with the church in Corinth.
What was going on in Corinth?
In Corinth, Paul was facing a group of opponents that he sarcastically labeled the super apostles or the false apostles. These men were coming into the church bragging about their spiritual highs, their spectacular visions, their impeccable Jewish pedigree, and their eloquent, sophisticated speaking skills.
They sound like the cynics.
They were basically acting like the Cynic philosophers or the Greek sophists, promoting themselves and likely charging exorbitant fees for their teaching. They challenged Paul's authority because Paul wasn't putting on a spectacular show. He wasn't speaking with soaring Greek rhetoric, and he wasn't constantly talking about his visions.
He wasn't flashy enough for them.
But Paul absolutely refuses to play their game. When forced to boast, he boasts instead of his weaknesses. He boasts of his beatings, his poverty, his sleepless nights, and his shipwrecks.
Which is totally countercultural in a Roman world that worships strength, status, and visible success. To boast about being beaten with rods is to boast about being treated like a slave.
It is entirely countercultural and deeply offensive to the Roman mindset. But Paul is redefining authority based on the legal concept of the shaliach.
How does weakness prove the proxy?
For Paul, the true mark of the authentic proxy is that the messenger gets completely out of the way of the message. If the messenger is physically weak, suffering, unimpressive in speech, and constantly harassed, but the message still shatters hard hearts and brings spiritually dead people to life, then it is objectively obvious that the authority behind the message belongs entirely to God and not to the human messenger.
That makes perfect sense.
Paul understood that if he leaned on his own ecstatic visions, his own pharisaical intellect, or his own rhetorical brilliance, he would obscure the cross of Christ. The message of a crucified, humiliated Messiah had to be carried by a crucified, humiliated messenger. His visible weakness was the legal proof of his proxy.
It is a staggering, completely upside-down view of leadership. Complete weakness, total suffering, and absolute submission to the sender, which naturally demands that we look at the ultimate example of this framework.
Yes, we have to look at Hebrews.
We have traced the word from passive Greek cargo ships to Jewish legal proxies in the rabbinic courts, to the Galilean disciples, and finally to the suffering of Paul. But the discussion must move to the book of Hebrews, specifically Hebrews chapter 3, verse 1, because this is the only place in the entire New Testament where Jesus Christ himself is explicitly given this title.
It is.
The author calls him the apostle and high priest of our confession.
It is a unique and incredibly significant verse in the New Testament corpus. By officially calling Jesus the apostle, the author of Hebrews is pulling all of these legal, historical, and theological threads together and applying them directly to the incarnate Son of God.
That is a huge statement.
But to truly grasp the weight of this title being applied to Jesus, we have to contrast this biblical view with the religious myths that were circulating heavily in the ancient world at that time.
The sources mention these ancient Gnostic and Mandaean myths about a heavenly ambassador of light. What were those myths teaching, and how does their view of a divine messenger differ from what the book of Hebrews is saying about Jesus as the apostle?
In the early centuries of the church, there were these syncretic, highly dualistic Gnostic religions developing alongside Christianity. They viewed the physical, material world as inherently evil, created by a lesser, ignorant god called the demiurge. The Mandaeans and various Gnostic sects had elaborate cosmologies and myths about a divine messenger, an ambassador of light, who was sent down from the pure spiritual realm, the pleroma, into the dark physical world.
Okay, so a messenger from heaven.
But in those myths, the ambassador simply comes down to drop off secret esoteric knowledge, often called gnosis. He gives his elite followers the secret passwords, the hidden rituals needed to get past the demonic planetary guards so their divine sparks can escape the evil physical body after death.
It sounds like science fiction.
The ambassador himself is basically just a cosmic delivery boy for esoteric data. He doesn't execute a legal transaction. He doesn't change the objective reality of the world. He just imparts a theory for escape.
He is basically handing over the cheat codes to the universe, to a select few people, and then immediately leaving the physical world behind.
That is an excellent way to frame it. The biblical Jesus, functioning as the apostle sent by the Father, is fundamentally categorically different. He is not just dropping off a letter of instruction.
He's doing more than speaking.
He is not just giving humanity a new ethical philosophy, a secret code, or an example to follow. In the biblical framework, based firmly on the strict legal institution of the shaliach, Jesus is the exact, unmediated representation of the invisible God.
Wow.
Because of the absolute unity of essence between the Father and the Son, his words are the actual words of God. His physical works are the works of God. And most crucially, his physical death on the cross is the saving, substituting action of God himself.
Because the proxy executes the transaction.
Yes, he does not simply bring a message about salvation. He executes the legal transaction of salvation in his own physical body, satisfying divine justice.
So if we apply the ancient rabbinic rule of the shaliach to the incarnation, that the emissary is as the man himself, then Jesus being God's apostle means something incredible for how we view God.
It changes everything.
It means that when you look at Jesus of Nazareth, you are legally, practically, and truly looking at the character and action of God. When Jesus forgives the paralyzed man, it is God legally forgiving sin.
Right.
When Jesus touches the contagious leper, it is God taking action to cleanse the unclean. When Jesus is hanging on the cross, it is God executing the transaction that reconciles a rebellious world to himself. It is the absolute zenith of the proxy concept.
That is the culmination of this entire historical and linguistic progression. We start our investigation with the secular Greek word for a cargo ship, a passive vessel moving grain across the sea.
And then it changes.
We see that word infused with the strict Jewish legal codes of the shaliach, creating a proxy who carries the exact legal identity of the sender into a courtroom. We see Jesus applying this immense legal weight to his weak, failing, uneducated disciples, giving them his absolute backing while demanding total, lifelong submission to his will.
And Paul taking it to the nations.
We see Paul embracing unimaginable physical suffering to prove he is a genuine proxy of a crucified Lord, rejecting the self-promotion of the Greek philosophers. And it all culminates in the staggering, awe-inspiring reality of the Creator sending himself into the world.
The ultimate apostle.
The ultimate sender becomes the ultimate apostle. The Father sends the Son, and the Son executes the decree of the Father so perfectly, so flawlessly, that to see the Son is to see the Father.
It is an incredible progression of an idea, moving from the docks of Athens to the throne room of heaven. Thank you for joining us on this intense study on Reformed thinking.
It was great.
We have tracked how an ancient shipping term was pulled off the Mediterranean docks, infused with strict Jewish legal codes from the rabbinic courts, and utilized by the New Testament authors to create a radically different concept of leadership. It is a framework of authority based entirely on physical weakness, on absolute obedience, and on the sovereign authority of the sender. The human messenger is nothing. The divine sender is everything.
And that biblical framework challenges every single modern instinct we possess about leadership, about self-promotion, and about personal independence. It asks us to view representation not as a platform for our own brilliance or a stage to build our own following, but as a vehicle for the one who sends us.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you to mull over as we close. We have examined the heavy legal weight of the shaliach. The ancient rule holds true, that the one sent is exactly as the one who sent them. So what does it mean for us today when we read in the Gospel of John that the resurrected Jesus turned to his followers in that locked room and said, "As the Father has sent me, I am sending you"?
Yeah.
He applied the precise same verb, the same legal proxy to his people. If you take the legal weight of that ancient word seriously, if you understand the total submission and the total authority it carries, it changes everything about how you walk out your front door tomorrow morning. Until next time, keep thinking.